Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kristen Greek, and I'm the Sales and Marketing Coordinator at VAI. Welcome to our fourth Tips and Tricks webinar series, where VAI presents steps you should take today to protect against cyber threats. Cyber attacks cost U.S. economy billions of dollars a year and pose a threat for individuals and organizations. This is because they often lack the security infrastructure of larger businesses to protect their digital systems for storing, accessing, and distributing data and information. Small and medium-sized businesses are particularly appealing targets for cyber criminals. In this special security webinar, we will review common cybersecurity best practices and the steps you can take to improve your company's cybersecurity protection plan. Presenting today from VAI is CIO Kevin Beasley.
Thank you, Kristen. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome. I guess somewhat of a not so light, pretty heavy topic today. And I guess tips and tricks, well, I guess this webinar is going to be about how not to get tricked, because that's actually what we're going to be talking heavily about is cybersecurity, what's going on today, what's going on in the world. So with that, I will move ahead. All right, so what we're going to cover, we'll cover a little bit of media coverage. We don't have to cover a lot of that. You see it all the time, every day, what's going on regarding cybersecurity. Then I'll delve into cybersecurity crimes, targets, security threats, some of the architecture, application, security models, and ways to protect yourselves and what to do going forward. And with that, we can jump into some of the things. I grabbed a sample of this, and if you ask anybody out there, depending on what numbers they're looking at, because there's so many different ways of looking at cybersecurity and who's reporting and who's not, whatever the number you're seeing, even though they don't necessarily always jive, it's big and it's out there. Just know that. It's, whether some are under-exaggerating, some are over, that's really inconsequential. It's there. It exists. I picked a couple of them that people know that were out there in the news. Caesars was one, and I got the other one coming up, which was, and that one primarily, and there's another one coming up that I have on the next one, because there was a specific type of cyber threat that was involved in that. The other one I picked was a local one. It was, it's got to be almost a year and a third ago that our local county got hit. And as to the active targets out there, local governments are always one of the top 5 targets, medical, hospital, schools, plus a variety of different industries. The current one that's been very active, you've been seeing in the media probably for the past 2 months, is water companies are getting hit. That's been an active wave of that also. This was the other one that tied together, and I did this actually when I was I was out in Vegas during one of these events. So both of these were social engineering attacks. It wasn't necessarily brute force that they forced their way through computers or necessarily even phishing. This was active monitoring of employees via social media and doing some social engineering monitoring and tracking to be able to actually convince a variety of players that were involved in this to allow access to people that shouldn't be allowed access. And some of the means going through that went through email systems and actually was able to defeat their multi-factor authentication. I'll get into a little bit of that as we go through. But I guess what's top of mind, although there's still plenty of other attacks going on out there, is ransomware. And there's various different means out there. And quite frankly, as long as there's cyber currency out there that can be anonymized, that's going to be an ongoing issue. That's another issue, I guess, to deal with outside of this as to cyber currency's impact and as a driver of a lot of these cybersecurity attacks that are going on in the world. It does also enable other actors to get involved into it that don't necessarily have the skills to do anything regarding ransomware or cybersecurity attacks. I'll go through common types. Indirect first. Indirect means that they're not necessarily actively interfacing to any of your systems or anything like that. It's your typical ransomware emails, phishing emails, any types of fraud regarding scams, whale phishing. Actually, I think the first whale phishing attack that ever happened to us was a good 15 years ago, but it was caught. It was passed down from our financial department to me. We figured out right away, but they knew everything about who was where, who to contact, and specific details. So it was a campaign specifically targeting. But, you know, we reported it. We reported it to the government, to the bank, and everything else, and all that. But that's how long some of these attacks going on. People think a lot of this is new, but a lot of this type of security and attacks and hacking goes back decades. It's only because of the massive spike in volume in the past 10 years that the general public is even aware of it, and probably the past 5 years it's in the news every day. There's various different types. Whale phishing is going to high-level people. Spear phishing is targeting certain specific individuals or a combination of individuals, as I mentioned before. Smishing that's SMS phishing. That's the text message you get on your phone trying to get you to click on a link to either infect your device or bring you to a location where you're going to give away some information that you're not supposed to. There's other types of things regarding squatting, URLs, IP infringements, things like that. Also, some of that on the intellectual property tends to be whether it's foreign actors and foreign governments or, you know, in the case of, you know, business-to-business type. And then there's your typical impersonation, identity theft, whether that's done through, a lot of that's done through emails and things like that. We actively have software in place to identify impersonations, and we do active scanning. We have multiple layers of it getting through so that if somebody's trying to impersonate somebody else from the AI, we catch it, filter it, quarantine it. It also stops some of our people from using their personal emails to send their business email accounts, but we just notify them that that's an impersonation, so that's not acceptable. So we give the employees plenty of other means of actually sharing data that they might have achieved through their personal email account. Plus, there's other types of indirect crimes where they're tracking cyber harassment, cyber stalking. Usually those are things that are happening today through social media. Common example usually happens, you know, at the teenage age and up, or through certain groups of people. Active cyber security crimes are active in that they're actively interfacing to your computer equipment, IT infrastructure. They're doing it based on keeping track of the common vulnerability scans are out there. There's a lot of tools that are out there to assist cyber criminals in keeping track of zero-day flaws, who has, where can they go buy something that'll exploit it, and so on. Ransomware, there's active, I list that in inactive and active because there are active methods of ransomware that once you've caught somebody, you're actively interacting and communicating in real time with the ransomware perpetrator. So where they're actually negotiating, you know, ransomware and so on. Then there's a variety of others that you've heard about, denial of service, botnets, which they're all over the place, all over the world, constantly attacking things. You know, I can look at my email account every day and there's attacks coming in from various different geographies of the world trying to break into my email account at Office 365. Our security is set up to block it. They don't get through, but, you know, we see it. We see all the attempts everywhere in your email. All your email systems, if they're any of the modern current ones, that they also have the tools in it. You can actually look at those yourselves. There's a lot of long-term ones, man-in-the-middle attacks. Usually they might involve insecure type equipment or, you know, many times inside of providers at IT, ISPs, or, you know, telecom providers and so on, or people who just are familiar with unpatched equipment and how to do a man-in-the-middle attack. Then there's other things, you know, password guessing, you know about the hack, you've heard about keystroke recording. I guess the new one in there is utilizing AI. as part of the attacks. AI has become a tool that's used in many different types of attacks today. And then there's a few others that have been well noted, regarding web injections, interpretations, DNS, spoofing, and poisoning. Targets, well, there's supply chains. You heard about the Colonial pipeline attack. That's a supply chain attack. In fact, that was a ransomware as a service type attack where the attackers did not actually produce the ransomware. They actually, in the dark web, rented it. And that was one of the few instances where the people who rented the software declared that they weren't the ones that actually did it, shut down business, and started up elsewhere because they knew there were so many people that would be after them for even renting that software out. Then there's other types of attacks. You've heard of ransomware where you pay the ransom and then they come back again and again and again. So then I mentioned also there's means of tracking all the vulnerabilities. I get reports every day from CISA about common exploitable vulnerabilities and known exploitable vulnerabilities that are out there. That's information that everybody can get access to, including the cyber criminals. And if they use it in AI databases, they can crank through pretty quick in figuring out what systems they are and so on, and find means of targeting them, whether they're buying access to something or buying lists or things like that. Also, phishing obviously is ongoing. You should definitely implement some anti-phishing tools. I'll talk a bit about that as we go on. Then there's other means that I leaned on a little bit earlier as to data mining. Data mining is finding out the correct people, and that was part of those two casino attacks. They used data mining, they identified the people, they tracked the people on social media, the people on the high-level IT people at social media were actually actively talking about how important they were and what their job functions and everything else, so they became the targets. So it became fairly easy over the course of months to track them, find out more about them, then to be able to make phone calls saying, I got a new phone number, can you change my text messaging number for when I need to do multi-factor authentication? That was one method that happened. The other one was, I think, through email, which about 2 or 3 weeks right after that, that's when Microsoft stopped supporting those methods of multi-factor authentication and require just authentication through their actual authenticator app or any of the authenticator apps. But there's other things too. Now they're also using AI to actually find this information quicker and faster. There's information you can actually just buy on the dark web, and if you ever looked at any presentations or people who actually work in the dark web to keep track of it, it looks like the regular internet. When you're going to these sites where you can buy malware and attackware, it might look quasi like an Amazon type or any type of e-tailer type site where there's products is listed. You can set up user IDs or not. They have ratings on them, ratings on the sellers, rating on the buyers. From the standpoint of being able to know who you can trust, are they going to give you? Because I guess in the situation of the dark web, if they want to make money, there has to be honorable fees. So it is amazingly that it looks like you're just shopping like you would anywhere, but you're buying ransomware attacks, DOS attacks, web bot attacks, any type of malware that you're looking, smishing attacks from text messaging. It's all there, different price plans. Usually it can be per email, per person, per time. If you're just wanting to run it for a week or two or something like that, they have all different varieties. And I've even seen one guy who was tracking some of them where they actually had some financing involved, which I found quite humorous. And of course, another one that's kind of disturbing, you're seeing a lot of people in the creatives industry, meaning musicians and artists and things like that. And you've probably heard stories about some deep fakes that are going on where you're using AI to impersonate people. There was one about within the past 6 weeks or so where a group of people, were having a group meeting on a Zoom type call, and all the people that were on that call, they thought they were fellow employees that they really didn't know that well, but they were all impersonating them, and they actually deceived them. So, but you can see many instances in the media on that. All right, and so there's other targets. I mentioned earlier the certain types of targets. Some of that is, some of the ransomware might be targeted. Some, I mentioned hospitals. Well, there's some that are specifically built to work well against hospitals, but might not work well against another industry or another group. Same thing with governments. They're getting very specialized. It's that advanced in the cyber security world, from the standpoint of the people who provide this type of malware. There's people who usually, they hire people who are experts in those industries to help them design the software that's going to attack and break in. You can see here a variety of different industries here. It's not all inclusive, but it's common ones that are getting hit all the time. As to what's being hit once they're in there, and I'm going to get into a lot of that also, but these are things that you obviously should be looking at. The top of the list always is going to be file shares. Once ransomware gets into a system, it's typically going to be scanning the network for vulnerabilities, but the most obvious one first that it looks for is map drive letters, or just scanning a network for UNC names, servers that are there, where it can see shares and things like that, and so on. So we're seeing, and have been seeing for years now, if you've attended other webinars that I've done, that many in the industry have been moving away from map drive letters and SMB protocol. IBM years ago moved all their employees to Box, which is HTTPS type file sharing service, and many others are using services like that. If you're at Office 365, you might want to use OneDrive in combination with SharePoint, so you're sharing through HTTPS. You might be loading things through OneDrive, but you'll be sharing to whoever else through HTTPS and bypassing the SMB protocol. So that is something to really look at and talk to your IT departments if there's a means you can reduce or preferably eliminate SMB, because it's the #1 target people are looking at. Obviously, some other tips as to what things you should share or not share. Never share the root of a computer, because that's usually a disaster waiting to happen. Other things that I've mentioned along, I'm not going to go through all the details because we have limited time, but there's your email, their SMS. Then there's other traditional ones like keyloggers and things like that you've heard about, and so on. Obviously, certain policies, that you should crack down on from the standpoint of user ID and password sharing. If you're using multi-factor authentication, that typically should negate password and user ID sharing. So that used to be something only when you're hitting public sites, but it's becoming, cyber insurance is starting to mandate it even in internal usage. And there's a variety of ways of achieving that. As to how remote workers access, and I bring that up because we've come out of the pandemic, but I think everybody now is used to remote access, so there's various different proper ways of doing it. Some methods that were done during the pandemic weren't necessarily, they were more slapped together and less secure, and it's time to go back if you haven't secured those up and secure them up as to what they can hit, how they're coming in, and obviously if they're making sure that you've got security in place, that if a remote system gets infected, you'll stop it at the edge. Same thing with mobile devices, that you want some means of monitoring them, or at least at a bare minimum, if you've got company data, email, things like that, that you can at least remote wipe it. So there's up to full-fledged mobile device management systems. Some architectural considerations. It's very common that people now run virtual machines. They run hypervisors such as VMware or PowerVM and so on. I mentioned PowerVM. There's other hypervisors out there like Hyper-V and others, but VMware primarily is still dominant, at least in the Intel world, and is a primary target. Certain things as to architecture in customers of ours who have gotten hit through VMware, it's because they ran a flat network and they didn't actually VLAN out this management network interfaces from their end user population. So an end user gets hit, it finds the vCenter server, it's unpatched, it takes down the server and encrypts the virtual machines and then sends a message that they would like ransomware. So that's something that you want to consider. Other things are attack surfaces, as I mentioned here. You want to protect those. You want to scan those. If you have, you probably, many of you might have cyber insurance security now that they actually do ask. They ask you, or you're required actually to get scanned by them from the outside, external scanning. But it's generally only half of the issues, because if you don't scan inside, if you get an internally affected computer, they'll attack you from the inside by going through that, phishing attempt through a computer, as opposed to going through an external floor in a web or an unpatched server or something. Also, various different complicated architectures are difficult to keep track of. So if you are running, you should have active scheduled scanning, and there's scanning tools that I mentioned, now attack surface management tools, which aren't point-in-time scanning like vulnerability and penetration testing, but they're actively scanning on an ongoing basis. No matter where your computing servers are, whether they're in a cloud or in a data center or anywhere else, or you're just using straight services, you still have to protect your own network, your own desktop computers, because they're going to be part of the attack surface that people are going after. Always have good identity and access management. Who the person is, multi-factor authentication, no sharing, and also restricted access. I have it coming up, but thinking about only giving access to what they need, least common privilege there. All right. As to the threats, well, I think we're not going to spend a lot of time on the left column, because I think you've all heard of all of these. Ransomware, virus, worms, Trojans. There are various different types. Most times, since there's so many and people don't want to go into the delves and differences between, because some is subtle. Like a Trojan isn't necessarily detectable malware. It's just something packed inside that might find access to something that, a profile, or say you have access to the right profile, could gain access without actually infecting something. So generally, we just refer to it as malware. And countermeasures. I'm going to go through quite a bit of countermeasures, but you want active scanners, as I mentioned, intrusion detection and prevention capabilities. So once something's detected, it prevents it either by notifying for shutdowns, or triggering locking down of systems, or triggering isolating anything that we saw was infected, like a desktop computer or something like that. Obviously, ongoing security testing, having multiple layers of anti-malware. We have on the edge, we have it in the clouds that we use, we have it in our cloud, we have it in a network, we have it on email. We have multiple different layers, so there's many different layers, and in the case of email, we have 3 layers that we have to go through from the standpoint, what's provided by our service provider, which we turned up to strict. We have another AI engine that scans everything that might get past that, and then, of course, we've got what's functioning at the desktop. So it would have to get through all 3 to be able to get through. And there's some interesting detections that we see that somehow they come up with means every now and then to sneak something through. So we actually will end up catching those just based on, we have a heuristic scanner that at least quarantines it for inspection. So. But they're very innovative in how they actually construct email to get through systems. Then there's new things regarding code signing, certificates. You'll see that a lot of the email providers are now starting mandating more security, from the standpoint of Google and Yahoo and Office 365 and so on. And I mentioned through the MGM and Caesars, and a couple of other well-known, I think there was some senators and some other foreign dignitaries and so on, had their email attacked through Office 365 based on what I mentioned earlier. Things that people were able to get in by using, human engineering techniques. Other things is signed code, knowing where you're getting your, applications from. I know there's big stories about the EU wanting to open up third-party app stores and things like that. Obviously, that's in the consumer world, but obviously that's going to open up a flood of other types of access to malware, another vector to actually have to worry about getting into your business. So, and if you've got people, sitting in the European market going into various different app stores that are now available, I think past history based on, what Google has to contend with all of their third-party app stores, it gets to be a lot to have to be able to keep track of. And then also the ability of sandboxing certain types of applications, certain types and applications that are written to be sandboxed. That's what a lot of mobile apps are intended to be, is sandboxed into their own environment, not be able to see other applications or other applications' data. There's two different methods of using that term. One is if it's regarding intrusion detection and prevention, is to sandbox in something. Another one is to design code that is sandboxed already. And obviously keep up on your patching. Have a regular patching, keep track of all the vulnerabilities that get detected on an ongoing basis, and patching them. As to the activities, I mentioned social engineering quite a few times. Spoofing is happening all the time. You've seen, everybody on this call and this webinar have seen spoofed emails pretending to come from somebody else. Some are quite good, and depending on the email provider and system, some catch it now, some are trying to catch it, some are forcing, that if that certain information doesn't match up, it will be rejected. So there's always ongoing battle against that. It's, but it is a battle, keeping up. And then, people don't talk about botnets, but they're much anymore, but they've been around for forever. They're still out there. There's a lot of home routers and things like that many times sit around and haven't been patched in years because people don't replace them, that are actively part of botnets going out and doing all this work. Tens and tens of millions of equipment around the world still activating as botnets, and many times people are unaware of it. As to some of the countermeasures, well, obviously, user awareness training. We do that here. We did it with social engineering. We used the service, to do emails where we actually whitelisted and allowed phishing emails that had no detrimental payload on them, but to see who would do what. Just to see how our employees would act. It's something that you should be doing. We do periodically just to see, if people are learning, and many people have, and then, we then go back and we find where people might need assistance or training and so on and so forth. I mentioned the patching. System hardening is quite a big issue in the computer world, where you'll see this all the time, that whether they're IT people or non-IT people install a computer, a Windows computer, or an operating system, an application, and leave the default settings set as is. Attackers look for that. They look for default settings. They look for services that are turned on that are not necessary, that might be unpatched, and they go after them. Hardening means only having the services and resources, whether it's on your desktop computer or on your servers or even mobile devices. If you don't need it, have it turned off, and obviously to be able to test it. The patching and sandboxing, I covered that also. Good policies and procedures. Know what to do. Have good policies to ensure that you have security so that people aren't allowed to do things. And typically, if they ask why they can't do something they used to be able to do, well, it's a new world today. Security dictates that they can't have access to everything like they used to, or be a local admin on their computer anymore, because typically insurance companies frown on that, and that's going to drive your premiums up if you've got a lot of people who are local admins on their computer. So also universal threat management subscriptions. I'll mention that again as it comes up. That's usually in your firewalls and firewall equipment or network security equipment. That's a subscription you usually have to pay for to keep the updates coming and flowing in on a daily basis. That's part of your prevention, where the actors are looking on a daily basis for CVEs and KEVs. That's your method of protecting against that, by having a firewall and a brand of of security software that does the same thing, does the same scanning, the same detection, and updates all of your equipment on a daily basis. That's as fast as it possibly can. It can be a little costly, but it's worth it, I think, nowadays. Other things to go through is, they're, leveraging technologies. Like I said, many of them are not sophisticated because the lure of, cryptocurrency and things like that drives them in, and they get a little bit of skills on how to navigate the dark web, and all of a sudden they could be running campaigns on their own. So they're using technologies themselves. They can use the same type of marketing tools, that marketers would use as to who opens something, which sites they go to, tracking where they're going to. The same tools that advertisers use to track, they use the same tools, and those tools are available also on the dark web. Things that an active campaign or a HubSpot or anything like that, there's dark web versions of those to track people to. Cloud providers are being targeted all the time. I have to say at this point, Microsoft's well aware of it, that they're probably the number one attack because they host so much email. And as I mentioned, they're constantly trying to screw the screws down and make things tighter and tighter. But, them and many others, email providers are high on the list because you can break into email. You many times can find the keys to the kingdom in there. So, and as I mentioned again at the bottom, the countermeasures, as I mentioned before, training, patching, intrusion detection, background checks on people. That's important based on the certain positions they're in. If they're going to be in charge of certain types of IT in certain industries and functions, that is something that should be done. Multi-factor authentication, and there's machine learning is being built into a lot of these security tools now, where it's looking at trends and it can add capabilities on the fly. By many times by using AI to actually create additional algorithms that the software did not have to be able to block something new without you necessarily having to wait on an update being sent down, or an update being sent down to add to an AI database or an algorithm database. Other things to look at is, your attack surface, insecure interfaces, APIs, things like that. Some of the same, but I think also one of the things I mentioned before was attack surface management software. We utilize that for all of our any public-facing interfaces. So if something was showed safe, last month because there wasn't a known vulnerability and somebody found it and published it, and now it becomes a known one, then all of a sudden it starts that particular, whatever it was, a website or a piece of code or an API, now shows up as vulnerable and needing to be patched. Other things to look at also that I haven't mentioned also is your service level agreements, what your legal contract agreements are with your customers or your vendors or so on. And additionally, business associates agreements, and I don't mention it here, but I do mention it further on, your cybersecurity insurance, which the premiums on that have grown astronomically. I can tell from hours because I go through all that on an annual basis, but it's gone, I guess, in the past 4 to 5 years, almost tenfold, so in the amount of cost. So. And then there's others, the obvious ones. Malicious insiders have a means of detecting people. Obviously, in large corporations, you can't keep track of anybody. If somebody, is malicious, somebody's a plant, a seed, or whatever, or somebody gets approached from the standpoint of, well, if you pay me I'll pay you some money if you give me some information on a flaw. There was a heist, I think, in LA over the weekend, and that's the direction that the law enforcement's looking, that somebody got paid to tell them where actually all that cash was in that warehouse. I think it was close to, they estimated $30 million, because they just knew where to go, and it was in a nondescript warehouse. So those are things, also that have to be looked at. That's where you get into security awareness training and least privilege access policies. From the standpoint who can know not only what they can access, but what they can know. So all things to consider. All right, some other measures, shared technology and countermeasures. I think when you get the presentations, you can go through some of these other specific details. Other things, data loss, leakage. Leakage many times can refer to like your public facing. Is your web server leaking out? The version, the patch level, information that will assist in an attacker saying, this is a vulnerable, this is not a vulnerable. Many times there's information leaked out of your website or leaked out of your browser, leaked out of other equipment, or that's where default configurations come into play, that you need to shut down what's being leaked out to the internet, because that's one of the things that's why there's scanners that have been scanning websites and scanning the internet going back to the 90s looking for vulnerabilities. So that's something that you always want to look at and make sure. And that's usually why you're going to want a vulnerability scanning, and then later after that, a pen testing scanning after you try to patch things. Then there's various different levels of attacking accounts, hijacking. I mentioned email hijacking before, but there's other methods of hijacking different accounts. That's always been something that key loggers have always been useful for, in hijacking accounts in that fashion, getting into bank accounts and so on, something going back a good, 2 decades. Other things regarding password enforcement, complexities, reuse, meaning you can't keep reusing or you can't just change one letter, making strict policies out there, and obviously either using a biometric or multi-factor authentication is probably going to become mandatory. You actually probably have been seeing and hearing about pass keys to see that for replacing passwords. I'm not going to go into the details here, but that is something else that works in conjunction usually with a biometric or other types of mechanisms. Other known things to look at, you can review all these details, I guess, when you get, the copy of this presentation. But there's some other areas we're going to jump into here. This is the application security. These are all your applications. And if you looked at all the things, and I've shown this in other diagrams too, these are all the things you have to protect and all the areas you have to look at. All the different departments, when you're looking at it, it's not just the IT department, the accounting system. It could be the marketing department. It could be other departments, human resources, other things, mobile, your shipping, your warehouse, your truck drivers, everybody who's using a computing device should be part of the whole security and plan. This just shows, and I've shown this one in the past, who provides what and where. If you're in a cloud, the cloud provider provides the security in the cloud, but you still have to protect all of your equipment that is not in the cloud. This just shows security responsibility. If you're private or on-premise, you manage all your security yourself, and various different cloud models have different levels of who manages what security. In the case of even the far right one, the software as a service, if you manage your own profiles for that applications, you still bear some responsibility and, of course, your network responsibility. These are various different ones for the network people that might be on the call, from the standpoint of how you design your networks, how remote workers can connect. Typically, you're always going to want to be able to control who's accessing your network and when and where, what hours of the day, schedules, things like that, and also have them pass through, some scanning detection from the standpoint of, what equipment they're using and is their device secure and so on. That usually requires them to do like a hub and spoke, that if your employees are going through one security model, it's going to detect a lot of things, and obviously you can control their access from, that hub. Obviously VLANing, implementing network security, good network design. There's means of, we're not going to go into the details, but there are means of obfuscating your network, whether it's RFC in 1918 obfuscations or other various other methods of doing it. Also, your firewalls. It shouldn't just be your edge protecting. You want to scan everything inside, north, south, east, west. I think I have some diagrams showing that coming up. And as I mentioned at the beginning, don't use the same manufacturer scan engine on the edge, on the desktop, and in your email scanner. A lot of security vendors will say, oh, you'll save some money if you do that, but if they get through that one scan engine, they're getting through everything. So we have always used different scan engines at different points. Whether it's on the edge, it's on the network, it's on an email, it's on everything else, it's a different scan engine. And also different scan engines potentially by operating system too. So, whether it's a Linux or a Windows or a Mac. So various different ones might work better on different operating systems. And obviously, not just only inbound, but also outbound. If somebody's in your network and gets through via email, you want to be able to control how it can go back, especially in the case of, whether it's ransomware or botnet. If it can't hit the command and control server out on the internet because you're not allowing unlimited access, which is egress outside your network, you'll at least, and that's how you might detect that a computer has been infected, so that you can isolate that and sandbox that computer. Here's what I mentioned earlier. The north-south is in and out of your network, ingress, egress. And then I have east-west at the bottom is all of your computing resources in your company, your HR applications or ERP or warehouse or marketing tools and everything else. That's if they're sitting on different hosts or virtualizing. I mean, a lot of times you'll see a production environment isolated from a staging environment from a development environment, which and in this example we show web, database, and the apps are all having to talk through firewalls. And they're not showing in there, but they're talking through firewalls and their packets are being inspected. So if somebody gets hit on the web, it's not going to traverse its way all the way in. All right, so in additional steps, you want to think of the world in a zero trust model. Zero trust, there's a lot of long definitions for it, but the short definition of zero trust is expect that somebody's already in your network. If somebody's already in your network, how do you protect your network? As I mentioned throughout, you want to harden everything from the inside, not just from the outside. You want all the tools looking at the inside as much as it's looking at the outside world. That's the way that I mentioned in the previous example, how you're going to catch that connection in-house and stop something from happening. It can successfully work. We've had plenty of customers who have adopted security in that model, and we had one computer that was a remote worker a couple of months back, and their computer got hit, but we were notified and shut the thing down right away. We cleaned and shipped a new computer out, got that one back, did some forensics on it. So, but yes, you can actually build a secure network to detect most of the common ones. If it's a state-sponsored actor, depending on what industry you're in, like military defense, something like that, you're going to have to look at a whole more secure level of access above and beyond what I'm talking about here, way down to military grade and high-level fifth-grade security. But for the average business, you still can secure yourself from a vast majority of all the attackers. Going down the list here, these are the things you'll want to be looking at. So, it could be the start of a business continuity or DRP type plan. I've done those over the years. If you wanted to go over a plan or contact someone here, and we can talk about some of these other methods of protecting things and things like doing business contingency planning, you can. Other things that you need to do, tools and services. You should be in a habit of doing external and internal penetration testing. We do with our own people, and we also do with outside providers, and of course our insurance company also scans too. So we've got 3 different layers that we can look at and compare one to the other. It's important in that regards because a lot of times even like the insurance provider scanners, they might come up with a lot of false positives based on how they have their tool set or whether their tool itself, certain tools can actually go and look at those databases that I mentioned that are out in CISA and other places and NIST and everything else to look at vulnerabilities and incorporate the latest data in the tools. Others might just be data that's updated, on a quarterly basis. So the tools themselves always have to be also analyzed, as to what's coming back. as accurate or not. I mentioned attack surface management that you'd want to do. That's something that's a new breed of tools I would say is relatively new from the standpoint of really only started hitting markets in 2018. That's the active scanning of what's going on from your public-facing internet, what's facing the world, where it's scanning, on a daily basis, sometimes hourly, or depending on their various different schedules, or based on what's going on in the world, what attacks are out there, and sending you email reports, or actually you just go into the portal and you can see email reports, or text you if there's something that it finds right away. So, yes, another great tool to have in your bag of tricks. From the standpoint of, the tools and tips aspect of the presentation. Obviously, you want to log events, and, depending on the size of your network, you might need more sophisticated tooling of like SIEMs and other security tools that are in place to keep track of things and so on. The security awareness, social engineering training, it's something you should incorporate on a regular basis, whether it's annual basis or semi-annual, things like that. It's something that you have to keep up on because social engineering methods also change a lot. So, as I mentioned, your desktop security doesn't go away. I specifically mentioned email. You should focus on your email, specifically the ones that I mentioned down there, DMARC, DKIM. Vimy is not quite taken off, but DMARC and DKIM are two things from the standpoint that help, one, you to be able to identify email that's coming in as being who it's from, and also from the standpoint of email that you send to others. And that's part of the Vimy component too, that you are who you say you are. So there are tools that are involved in that pretty much are becoming mandatory, that you probably want to look into whether or not you've got proper DKIM, DMARC on your email. The other one most people are still not aware of, but for the text messaging world, there's something called 10DLC, 10 digits local carrier, I think is what it was. It's a method of registering if you're doing text messaging campaigns and messaging people or anybody that's anonymously where you're sending a text message, you're supposed to register with whoever your provider is. If it's your mobile phone provider, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, if you're using a VoIP provider like we use RingCentral, or it could be 8x8, or if any other provider where they also offer SMS messaging, you now have to create campaigns and register, and there'll be databases. This is growing. It's growing, so it's not fully cooked. But eventually it's to the point where if you get a text from somebody and it's not listed as being a legitimate campaign, it automatically just gets blocked. So, and I know a lot of the phone company providers already have software in place that you'll see a lot of suspected spam messaging, in your phone service and everything else already, but this is above and beyond that. It also messaged, from the standpoint, the zero trust earlier. This just mentions a few other items in here, specifically at the bottom, obviously keeping all of your firmwares up to date, hypervisors. Many times people will let, a Windows Server auto-update, whether it's Windows Server or desktop, but they're not patching the hypervisor, which is below it, or the firmware on the actual, whether it's a BIOS on a desktop or the firmware on a server, those need to be patched also. Access control, identity management, yes, you need to reverse thought and actually only give least privilege access to anybody. And obviously, in protecting data, you have to have offline storage. That's the only surefire, disconnected way that if something does happen to you, that it's not going to be affected. Meaning, and it's clean, and there's multiple copies of it, so if you do get hit, it's what's going to enable you to recover quickly. So I guess a list of to-dos, you want to look at your universal threat management. That is software. I use the term universal threat manager because that's the term Fortinet uses in their firewall. It's a subscription, whether it's Cisco or some other providers or SonicWalls or WatchGuard, they have all their own names for the subscription. And the thing to note with certain types of firewall, low-end firewalls tend to go end of life and therefore stop getting updates sooner than as you move up the line. Once your firewall stops getting patched, it's pretty much done. It's time to replace it. Low-end firewall equipment, depending on who the provider is and where it came from and whatever, might be as short as 4 years lifespan if they stop patching it, issuing updates for it. Typically, something that's commercial is going to have a good 5, maybe even 7 years if you're moving into higher-end models. And the very high-end models where you're talking like a $10,000 and up firewall, they might have a 10 to 12 year type lifespan because they're going to continue to push out updates for that equipment for that long. And other particular things, we use a lot of different internal scripting tools, open source, and additional purchased products that we use to scan all of our infrastructure and everything else. I get daily, weekly, and weekly CISA, which is Department of Homeland Security in the United States. I know some of you might not be from the U.S., but you can access their information. That's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I do have a slide coming up on that because if you are a U.S. entity, you can actually consult with them and get an advisor, no charge from them. I would have to say their resources are spread thin because of things that are going on in the world, but I'll talk to that when I bring up that other slide. I mentioned attack surface management. We use IBM's Randori, which is scanning all of our external-facing interfaces and reporting back all the time, in addition to all the other tools and vulnerability and penetration scanning that we're doing. The scanning security awareness training, you should have some sort of policy, put something in, and actually test your employees through a variety of different means, whether it's when they go to a website or whether it's testing to see if they go to a website they shouldn't, or opening an email they shouldn't, and so on and so forth. If you need information regarding that, you can contact us, and we can either work out a plan or discuss who you might want to talk to regarding that. If you don't have a BCP plan, business contingency or continuity plan, you should create one, and that covers data recovery, which I mentioned before. Vaulting is usually the preferred method nowadays. I mean, obviously you can have tape and offline tape, but if you did, usually many of our customers use both at this point. High availability is just for application uptime, which is not data protection, but it is for having uptime. And I mentioned the data recovery planning, data vaulting, cloud storage, and also many times the people who are reviewing your cyber insurance are not people who are in IT. They are, maybe under the prevalence of, CFO or something like that, but you have to work in conjunction with who's ever looking at the insurance policies and, and know what the requirements are and know what the contractual obligations. If you don't do that, cyber insurance is notorious. If you don't dot all your I's and cross all your T's, it's just like if many businesses had business interruption insurance. Well, if you don't do something like have a BCP plan and you never plan to be able to recover your business, you will not get that business interruption insurance, even if you paid that premium. The same thing happens with cybersecurity insurance. If you don't do your due diligence, there's outs in there, fine print that says they won't pay. So get everybody and the right people involved in that. And here, we're coming up to the end, and I mentioned I would just give you a slide on CISA. They call them advisors, not agents. So, but everybody in the U.S., they are regional, set regional up. If you contact, you can actually find one. Like I said, they're not always easy to get a hold of, but they do offer some of these tools. Some of them you can download, or plans and things like that. That are no charge, and if you even advisors, from some of you that have seen some of my previous presentations over the years, I've done a couple of presentations with CISA advisors.